Good afternoon and welcome to Norwegian American Genealogical Center and Naiseth Library. Today's webinar is going to deal with some subjects that we need to have a better understanding of in order to help to locate where your family may have come from in Norway. Topics will include a little bit of history of Norway, counties, communities, clerical districts, and the farms in Norway. The first thing that we're going to be looking at is a little bit of background of Norway. If you did not print out the handouts for today's program, I would suggest that you stop now, go back and print it out, because one of the items is a timeline, Norway timeline, and we'll be looking at that periodically, dealing with early history of Norway. So if you have the handout in hand, then we're ready to proceed. To begin with, Norway has been an agricultural society from the beginning. Archaeologists have told us that between 5000 to 4000 BC, agricultural settlements have been discovered, or remnants of those have been discovered around the Oslo Fjord area. Now gradually it spread into the southern coastline of Norway, and it included growing crops and raising livestock. So agriculture, even during the time period of our ancestors, was not a new item. The 1801 census, as an example, for Norway shows that 80 to 90% of the population lived in rural areas, and their primary occupation was agricultural. By the 1865 census, it still shows 75% of the population was living in rural areas and was involved in agriculture. So it is and has been a significant number. Now, this is dealing with the good old Vikings, and kind of touches on the situation with Harald the Fair-Haired. In today's world, the internet has introduced us to a lot of information, both good and bad. And there's a lot of websites out there that will lead you to believe that almost everybody is related to King Harald the Fair-Haired. And that may be right, that may not be correct. We really don't know at this point in time. But one of the things about, we'll be coming back to Harald the Fair-Haired in just a short time period. One of the things that people have a tendency to use to make their connections back to the Viking era is the sagas. But the sagas really are not a source, because it was an oral tradition that was handed down and wasn't put into written form until sometime in the 13th century, which means that the stories obviously have changed over time, because any time you're dealing with an oral tradition, each time the story gets told, it may improve. It's kind of like playing the old telephone game where I tell somebody something and then you go around the room, and by the time it gets back to me, I have difficulty recognizing what you're talking about compared to what I said initially. So that in itself is one of the problems. The other issue here is that during the Viking era, and for a little bit into the post years after the end of the Viking era, there was a lot of conflict within Norway. Internal civil wars were being waged over who was the ruler. The ruling system in Norway was set up in such a way that things could change, and I'll be talking about this again very shortly after we get through the current one. And it's true today even that scholars and historians continue to debate the historical accuracy of Sturluson's work in writing down the history in the sagas. But anyway, during the Viking Age, the main part of the country that was involved in the Vikings was the southern and the southwestern coastal areas of Norway. The ownership of land was mainly by force more than anything else, but over time small communities started to develop along those areas. The Vikings themselves were farmers during the off season, but in the warmer parts of the year, the Vikings liked to go exploring, and in the process of doing that, they developed new settlements as well as other activities. And so Ireland, for example, Dublin was founded by Vikings, and they've been able to do archaeological diggings in that area to prove that the Vikings were there. Now, when it came to introduction of Christianity, that helped to put an end to the Viking era because the Vikings themselves were all pagan. So now we're back to dealing with Harald the Fairhair and unified Norway. He's given credit for unifying Norway, but in reality, the parts that he unified were not necessarily countrywide. Most of the area that he was involved with is this red that's down on the bottom coastline and going up to close to the Bergen area. The yellow over here was controlled by one of his henchmen, and as well as the Moor area, which is approximately where Moor or Romsdal is located today. And then this area, the purple, was areas that were again controlled by another one of his henchmen. They all had to answer to Harald the Fairhair, but the problem with this whole situation is that you always had to be keeping an eye on your backside, because so much of this was controlled by whoever had the most money, the most military force, and you could be king today, but tomorrow someone else could have the job. And that again goes back to what I said about the internal civil warfare that was going on in Norway at that time period. So moving on into the Middle Ages, the land ownership by that time was again by kings that were pretty much self-appointed. The Catholic Church, which was the church as we during the introduction of Christianity to Norway, and then again some wealthy individuals who owned large tracts of land, and a system in Norway developed of renters and leaseholders. So the land was owned, but it was absentee landlordship, and underneath that then would be leaseholders who also had people renting under them. Now, one of the things that happened in Norway that we've talked about in the past is the Black Plague. So in 1347 to 49, right in that time period, there was a lot of over 50% of the population died during the Black Plague. And so this meant that Norway became a pretty sparse populated country, and not only was it repopulated by the Norwegians that survived the plague, but also by outside people that came into Norway to help increase the population of the country. And in particular, at this time period, there was strong influence by the Catholic Church. Now, Norway was unified with Denmark in 1397 and remained that way until 1814, when they were traded off to, Norway was traded off to Sweden, and we still didn't have Norwegian royalty. We only had the royalty of Denmark, and then eventually the royalty of Sweden. And then Reformation and Lutheran religion was introduced by Denmark in Norway in 1537, and at that point in time, the Catholic Church was essentially thrown out, and the priests and nuns that were there either had to become Lutheran or they had to leave the country. Now, when we get up into the 1600s, the land pretty much was still owned by kings, but these were maybe more tribal, and then the church, and again, absentee landowners. But by the 1700s, the church started to sell off the farms to individuals. The population had pretty much increased again. The only exception is that in each of the developing communities, there was one farm set aside for the support of the pastor. And the government became more functional and started to organize government into a more countrywide situation. So in the old days, before 1918, we had what were called amps. This is a Danish word. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see the names of the fylkes. On the right-hand side, the names, some names stayed the same. Akershus Hedmark, for example, but others changed names in 1918, and they dropped the name Amt and went to using the name Fylke. Now, one other interesting thing about this is that Oslo and Bergen in 1918 were also listed as not only being cities, but they were also listed as being counties. Bergen, sometime in the 1970s, the county status was dropped and it's just now a city, whereas Oslo today still serves as a county and a city. So that's kind of an unusual situation. So what do these counties or fylkes look like? Now, as far as the Norwegians are concerned, they consider them to be somewhat equal to our states, except on a smaller scale. But most commonly, we refer to them as counties, and it's probably because of the size. But here's the outlay of the fylke of Telemark. And then you'll see these dotted lines, and within each of these dotted lines is a kommune or a community. And each of these has a name along with it, and usually has a city location where the government headquarters are located. Their government situation is very similar to ours here in America, where they have a governor and then the usual kinds of offices underneath it. Now, one of the things that many people bring to us when they come in to do research are examples from their family stories with hints about the possibility of where people had come from in Norway. And here, for example, we have Grandma always said she came from Valdres. Well, Valdres, we know, is a specific area in Norway, but there's more to the story than just being from Valdres, so that's something to keep in mind. We'll be talking a little bit more about that very shortly. Grandpa said he came from near Oslo. That's one that we truly do love, because we had a visitor here a number of years ago who came in and said that her grandmother said she came just from north of Oslo. And when we finally found the family, it turned out that they had come from just a little south of Trondheim. While that is north of Oslo, we expected that it would have been closer to Oslo than what it really turned out to be. Family story was that the family lived in Telemark, so that gets us to a county, but then we still need to take into closer detail. Family story was that the family lived in Land. Well, Land again is a community, or I'm sorry, a fylke in Norway, but in today's world there's two. There's Surland and Nordland, so we still have a little more information to delve into. Now, the last one is that sometimes families have stories that they came from a specific farm location in Norway. And I like using this as an example because the Vik farm, which Vik in Norwegian means an inlet or a cove or a bay. And the problem with that is that there's 118 farms named Vik located in 17 different fylkes in Norway. So the farm name doesn't always help to know. So we have some clues. Valdres, for example, is an area in the Oppland area of Norway, which is in the eastern part of the country. but it's made up of 6 different clerical districts. So knowing that your family says they may have come from the Valdres area, that helps us to know, but we still have to go through 6 different locations to be able to come up with an answer. Gudbrandsdal is a large valley on the, again, in the eastern part of the country, but it too is made up of 9 different clerical districts. Hallingdal is another valley, which is made up of 5 different clerical districts. Hardanger, which is towards the west coast of Norway, again, 5 different clerical districts. And then there's an area around the Oslo area called Ringerike, and that's made up of 10 different clerical districts. So the locality, the farm name, the parish, or the fylke all provide clues as to where in Norway your family potentially may have come from. Well, how are these communities divided up? Here we have Aurdal in Oppland, and originally Oppland was one kommune as well as one prestejeld. The prestejeld is the clerical district. The kommune is the civil unit. And Aurdal initially was one unit with one church in it, and the government office is located in that area. Now, the division or the difference between a prestejeld and a kommune, the prestejeld is the clerical district. And then under the clerical district, you can also have a sogan, which is the local church. So in the case of Aurdal, if there was some sort of a natural barrier, there may have been another church in the other part of Aurdal, which would be known as the local church. The clerical districts are responsible for the baptisms, the confirmations, the marriages, the burials, moving in and out of the parish, and also for vaccinations. Norway was one of the first countries, and they led the way for vaccinations for smallpox. And you had to be able to prove in Norway for both confirmation and marriage that you had been vaccinated. Now, in addition, we have the kommune or the community. The community is responsible for the civil records, the court records, probate records, the small courts comparable to our circuit courts here in the United States, as well as land records and military records. In today's world in Norway, there is civil registration, but historically it was always, all of those pieces of information were handled by the church. And our next presentation is going to be dealing with looking at the church records and what they mean and how you go about gathering the information from them. Okay, so going back to Aurdal, in some situations there is a body of water or a mountain range or a big hill that prevents the people from getting to church, and so they decided to divide off these communities. As an example, the area where my grandmother came from in Møre og Romsdal, there's the fjord divides the main church, which is on the south side of the fjord, from the northern part of the Norddal fjord, or Norddal kommune. And so eventually they built a church on the north side so that the people that were on that side of the fjord would be able to attend church no matter what the weather was. So what we ended up with is now we have the main church and we have the local church, and eventually the kommune was also divided, and in today's world we have Nord Aurdal and we have Sur Aurdal. The prestejeld arrangements are somewhat similar to what happened here in America, where churches were often bundled and served by the same pastor. So they didn't always have services every Sunday, depending upon the frequency at which time the pastor would be present. Over time, they separated and became independent churches. So, for example, Leikanger Prestejeld contained the following local churches: Fjørland, which is now called Mundal, Leikanger, Sjugum, and Vangsnes, and Balestrand also is part of area today. So all of those were one prestejeld at the time, but in today's world they are separated. Okay, so now we're in, this happens to be Karmoy, which is an island down across from Stavanger. And this is the southern end of the island, and the clerical district is known as Skudneshaven, and the church is in the Skudneshaven area. Now, there is also a local church called Falness that helps to serve this part of the island, and the Skudneshaven serves the farms on that side of it. But each of these farms has a name and a number to identify it. And this particular farm, number 47, is a farm called Vik, and this is the place where my grandfather came from in Norway. But you can see that these farms are unusual shapes. The island is surrounded on this end by water completely, and Skudnes serves as the harbor, and it's called Skudneshaven, meaning Skudnes harbor. You can see up here that there is another clerical district and another one over here that is part of the northern part of the island. Well, these farms also have two things in common. Each farm name that has the least a registered deed has a name as well as a number. And historically, these farms were farmed collectively by a family unit, but the only one that was entitled to inheritance of that property was the oldest male child, which presents a problem for the rest of the family as to what they do. They could continue to live on that farm and help with the farm labor, but they would never be able to own it. Now, if the oldest male son had gotten married and married a woman that was entitled to a farm, then he would give up his right to the farm, except that he had so many years to be able to come back and take possession of that farm, even if somebody else was living on it at the time. So the farm numbers have names and numbers, and they also had division numbers. So a farm number is a Gurnummer and a Brucknummer is a division. And you'll see these abbreviated in this fashion. So this particular farm we're going to call the Holland farm, and it became popular after Norway found out in other countries that the farms could be divided up and given to two sons. And so in this situation, the father decided to divide the farm, and there was a lease for the upper half and for the lower half. And this upper half became known as the Nordhordland farm, and the southern, the Surhordland farm. Now, in addition to that, they could also use the term Ovra, which means the upper or the higher farm. Nedra means the lower, and they could continue to use the same name, but use the Nord and the Sur along with it. The other option is that this particular farm could be given a new name by the owner of the land, and that would then become registered with the government as well as the Holland farm. Then another little twist to it is that maybe at some point in time someone divides the lower farm into two, and this now becomes division 3 of the farm, and at that point in time you could use the terms either Ost, meaning east, or West, meaning the western farm. So these farms got divided up into smaller and smaller chunks of ownership. Then in addition to the leased parts of the farm, you also had places on the periphery of the farms that were called husmandsplods. Husman's plods are similar to the cotter's place in other European countries. These people had a contract with the landowner, but they only paid rent. They would never own the land. And this class of people have a tendency to be the highest numbers that came to America, because there was essentially no future in America, I'm sorry, in Norway. Their only future was that if by chance they could marry a farmer's daughter, and in this situation she would be marrying below her social status. So it wasn't a terribly acceptable situation to be in. The Husman class had to either pay cash rent for the farm, or they had to provide labor during certain periods in the year to the farm owner. And that was all spelled out in the contracts that they had. They had annual contracts. On the West Coast, these people very often went out in the winter months to go fishing, and they would hopefully earn enough money to be able to come back and pay the rent, and they would not have to work for the farm owner during the course of the year. The other thing about the Husman class people was that they very often became the artisans. They became the blacksmiths, the tailors, the shoemakers, the carpenters, or they worked in the woods, cutting trees and what have you. And if they were able, again, to raise enough money, they were then able to pay the rent without having to work for the farm owner. Now, going back to the Husman, there's two classes of Husman. There's Husman Medjord, meaning that with land, meaning that they rented a small piece of property along with a house, and that land was probably not much larger than a kitchen garden. The other version is Utenjord, meaning without land, and these people just simply rented the house, and once you stepped out the door, you were on the farm owner's land and not in your property. So going back to the Vik farm again, you can see that there's clusters of building, and here we have Nedre Vik, and here is Ovre Vik, and this cluster is called Midvik, which would be the middle part of it. This is collectively is where they lived, but the farm was operated by these are different divisions within that farm, and the land that was tillable or was used for grazing was used collectively by the owners of these little sections here. And then in addition, you have some little places that are indicated. Those could very well have been Husman's plots on this particular farm. Well, here is the big issue. In 1750, this is a Hoynes, which is a neighboring farm to the Vik farm. You had 4 owners of the property. The width of this band determines the amount of acreage that's involved in this particular location. Then as you go up the timeline, you come to 1800, you come to 1850, and you come to 1900. And you can see that the farm is being divided up into smaller and smaller chunks of land, so that by the time you get up to 1900, there is really very little land left for someone to be able to support a family. So this gentleman probably was able to still provide food for his family, but when you get into some of these other divisions in 1900, you can readily see that this is why they were coming to America, because there just wasn't enough land on each of these individual farms to be able to continue to support a family. Now, another item that we have related to the communities are the Bygdebook. These are community histories that are written in Norway. And we have a rather substantial collection of them here, as well as the University of Wisconsin Memorial Library and some other libraries, University of Minnesota, and of course the University of North Dakota. They have probably the best collection here in the United States. Salt Lake City at the Mormon Library has a collection of Bygdeböcker also. The plural, by the way, is B-U-K-E-R, meaning Bygdeböcker, meaning many or more than one. Now, the biggest problem with these is that not every community in Norway has produced a book. They're only done in the rural areas, so that you have no reference for these in the city areas of Norway. And they're not all written in the same fashion. Some have several volumes, one dealing with the history of the farms, maybe another volume dealing with the culture of the people in that area, and then another separate volume for genealogy. The older volumes may only cover the landowners, and they have very few photographs, and they're very often written in dialect Norwegian, so it's a little more difficult to translate them. The newer volumes usually cover all people in the Kommune and contain photos and are written in bookmal. So for us Americans, it's a little bit easier to read those. Now, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of how you can track a family backwards using these books. And in this case, it's quite easy because it's done an outline method. So you start out down here at Matilda Christine, Anders' daughter. She inherited this farm because she was the only the male members of the family, with the exception of Hjalmar, and he had married and had gone to another farm. So she became the inheritance for this particular farm. So here she is, and then if you go back up to Anders Havardsson, you'll see Matilda is listed here. This is her father, her year of birth, her marriage, and the person that she married and where he was from in Norway. If they were to leave to go to America or to another place in Norway, it again shows that information in these different in the information on the right hand side of the screen. So now we can go to Anders, and if we go up here, you will see that Anders is the first male child in the family, and he indeed inherits the farm. And we now have his parents' names, and we look for Harvard here, and we go over to the left-hand side of the page, and it appears that Harvard's parents are not listed here. He may have been from another portion of the Hestatun farm, but his father did not own that farm. But Harvard purchased the farm and married, and his family is shown here. And the one interesting thing about going back to Matilda here, because she got possession of this farm, she became the most desirable woman in this particular parish, and it didn't matter how ugly she was, and if she had a big wart on the end of her nose, the guys would all be knocking on her door because they knew that if they married her, they would not get direct control of the farm, but they at least would have a working farm that they would own along with her, and potentially would be able to leave it to their children in upon their demise. Now, another way of doing, especially in the outline form, for example, is this method, and you'll find several of the books done in this fashion. This is Nordahl, and they do have another book that deals with the history of the farms and what have you. But the genealogy is all in one particular book. And here you have the name of the parent, and this says that she came from the Duving farm, and it gives you this number. So here, for example, Lars Knudsen is number 201C. You go up here, and here it tells you that Lars is the son of Knut Nielsen. He was born in 1838, died in 1920, and he went to Hoyala 203. So here is his family. This shows the year that this couple married, and then the names of their children, and then also where they went. Now, it's ironic that this entire family went to America with the exception of Karen. She's the only one that didn't go. But all of the family came back from the U.S. with the exception of Lars. He stayed in the U.S., Madison not being Madison, Wisconsin, but Madison, Minnesota. So again, this can help with tracking your family backwards in time. Knut is, again, the Knut that's mentioned here, and it says that from 200, and over here it says that he went to 201. So he, descendancy again is shown in this particular situation. Now, some of the books are written in dialogue, and so these again provide the information, but it's a little trickier because you have to read through all of the text to be able to follow it. So here for the Boeverud farm, this is a place that is under Ulleran, and it gives some background information on it and what have you. And finally you get to where Ola Osbjorn daughter married with Britta Knut's daughter, a Christian's daughter, and they were renter folk on this particular farm, but they had been at Strand, and then eventually it gives you the names of the children. And in this situation, it's good because it gives you the name, the years of birth, whereas sometimes it only gives the names in, we presume, chronological order, but that's not always the case. Another version, again, where they are following the family, but this one is a little bit nicer in that it's uppercase and then provides the information about the wife and what have you, and then goes on to list the children. You'll notice here that this is farm number 82, and this is division number 4 of that farm. And you will find in most of the books that this is how they handle that particular situation. Now, this is a set of books that's written by a gentleman by the name of, or has been put together by a gentleman by the name of Lars Oina. This is in the Luster area in Sognefjorden. And Lars has spent significant times here in America tracing these families that left the parish to come to America. And what he has done with his books is that he gives you the owner of the farm, the usual information, and then he comes down and lists the first generation, his children. So here we have Thomas Ness, who went to America in 1892, and it then goes on and talks about Thomas, where he settled in America. Sometimes we'll give his death date, what his occupation was, and who he married, and it may even provide some information on the children itself. And then here are the, actually Thomas is Torsten, but he became Thomas here in America. And then it shows the children of this couple and gives you specific information about each one of them here in America, identifying where they settled, his occupation, when they died, and they usually don't list the next generation, but they will make comment on the number of children that each of these couples has. So his books are what I refer to as the Cadillac, because They really provide a lot of information, and it helps you to know that you've, when you tap into these and you tap into your family, that you are on the right track. So this comes to, we come to an end for today. Again, like I said, the timeline is quite helpful. It takes you up to the end of World War II with information on not only the earlier days, but it goes on and talks about the current situation in Norway going back to 1905 when we became totally independent, and the people of the country chose the current king and queen of Norway. He was a Danish prince originally, and she was a British princess. So again, that makes it interesting because the situation with the royalty of today is not necessarily tied into the royalty of the past. And lastly, we have a cartoon for our friend Hagar, and this time he meets a very unusual individual, Popeye the Sailor Man, but he is now wearing a Viking helmet as well. So lastly, I would like to again give thanks to the Bryant Foundation in Stoughton, Wisconsin. It is through their generous support that we are able to be able to present these webinars to you at no cost. And the next webinar, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be related to the church records, both here and in Norway, and what they contain that can help you with your continued research. Thank you very much and have a good day.